All right, hey everyone. Now it's time to get into our discussion of federalism proper. So, last time in the last slides, we looked at or previewed the Supremacy Clause, which is located in Article 6, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And if you take a look at this slide here, it says that this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, essentially the laws of this new United States that are going to be made on the basis of the Constitution, and all of its treaties, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, which means they have to respect that law and they have to uphold it. And anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. And so that last piece, that's a really important piece of this Supremacy Clause, because it says, essentially, if there's anything in the Constitution or laws of your state, then that stuff does not matter as long as there is a law at the federal level that supersedes it or that contradicts it. And so, of course, one thing that we want to make clear and we want to remember is that every state does indeed have a constitution. Right? We all have, Maryland has a constitution. Every state in the union has a constitution that sets up its own internal laws and sort of political rules, right? The way that the governor's office works, the way that the state legislature functions, and all sorts of other different details. And so this Supremacy Clause says that despite the fact that you have these state constitutions, in fact, those state constitutions predated this U.S. Constitution in the case of all of the states that ratified it, right? Despite the fact that you've already got these existing laws, if you have a new law that's passed by this new federal Congress at the national level, I'm using federal and national interchangeably here, this national/federal Congress that we've established for the House of Representatives and the Senate, if they pass a law, then the states need to pay attention to that law, and they cannot have any rules that contradict it. And so that's a really important sort of piece of the U.S. Constitution that deals with federalism by establishing, again, the supremacy of the federal government. Another thing that is really important to note in the design of the Constitution as it relates to federalism is the elastic clause. And this, I think, combined with the Supremacy Clause, it gives you a real insight into how the framers intended this setup to work and some of the maybe unintended consequences of the design of the Constitution. That means that this federal government is now much bigger and much more powerful than maybe even some of those founders would have envisioned. And so in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, we know that the U.S. government is granted these enumerated powers. And so if you look in that list, if you go to Article 1, Section 8 and you read that, it's essentially just a list. It's actually a fairly short list of things that Congress is expressly granted permission to do. So perhaps the most important thing is they can levy taxes. There's a reason why we pay taxes to the federal government. That is one of their constitutionally expressed enumerated powers. They can borrow money. That's one of the reasons why we see that the federal government can run a budget deficit, whereas some states are bound to not run budget deficits. They can regulate commerce, sort of broadly defined. They make rules about naturalization, about how somebody becomes, somebody who migrates to the U.S., how they actually become a U.S. citizen. They have regulations over currency and how we, essentially mint money. Post offices, actually, is one of the very first things that Congress sets up at the very beginning of test driving this Constitution is a national postal service. Research and development, so they can invest invest monies in things that will help us design new technologies to get ahead as a country. So, for example, the National Science Foundation, a number of different other organizations exist to this day to help us do R&D. One really important topic to the framers was punishing pirates, telling pirates to stop raiding our shores, and so the federal government could engage in anti-piracy laws, partially because this was very widespread in this kind of frontier territory that was essentially the coast, the east coast of the U.S. This was not like a well-established old country, right? This was a very new. This was a territory essentially. It was the outer rim essentially of the British Empire until we declared independence, and so we were still essentially this very fragile kind of fledgling state. And so a lot of what we did was designed to just set up the basics, right? And so these enumerated powers really are things that the framers of the Constitution felt would be essential to running a federal government that would help to coordinate some of these directives, like the post office, for example, so we could send mail back and forth between the colonies. It's like an important role. However, you can see that this is actually a pretty short list, and it doesn't include a lot of the things that we would consider to be important for government today. I mean, so for example, you might look at this list and think to yourself, where's like healthcare? Like a lot of these, Republicans and Democrats have been debating various healthcare bills in Congress over the last, several decades, and we've seen landmark pieces of legislation like the Affordable Care Act passed. That's not in the enumerated powers. It's not listed in this list in Article 1, Section 8. So how is it that Congress has such expansive scope of legislation that they can make rules about virtually anything? That's a really good question. So the way that this works ultimately is that the necessary and proper clause, or what's also called the elastic clause in the Constitution, that's Section 8, Clause 18 of Article 1, essentially says that Congress can interpret new laws, or their ability to make laws about new things. So it's written here that Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So what that means essentially is if we go back to this list of enumerated powers, in order to do things like regulate commerce, right, we might need to engage in things outside of that express sort of area of legislation. And so the elastic clause has been interpreted over time as this essentially a gateway into passing legislation about new and different topics. But at the beginning, for the first several decades of American government, the enumerated powers were essentially pretty much everything that Congress engaged in. They pretty much did this stuff. And so one of the key sort of takeaways of this discussion of federalism is that for much of the 19th century, we saw that American politics at the federal level was actually very circumscribed. The federal government was obviously much more powerful than it was during the Articles of Confederation period, and it was very successful at solving some of the coordination problems, such as raising an army to be able to do things like defend America against outside threats. Despite the fact that we didn't do the best job ever in the War of 1812, the Madison administration didn't do a great job raising an army or really a navy until it was almost too late. And Washington was burned. Actually, the capital was burned by the British in 1814, partially because we still didn't overcome some of these coordination problems at that time. So again, we had a very weak government to start out. And one of the reasons why there was a lack of coordination or a lack of federal strength was that, again, the states were really where most of the power was. The federal government was almost never interpreting their role of anything beyond the enumerated powers that were written in Article 1 of the Constitution. However, over time, and especially in the 20th century, we've seen that the federal government has started to move into other areas in terms of the scope of its authority. And so the elastic clause has been used as a way to establish the constitutionality, or essentially the basic legality of those moves. So the Supreme Court, of course, has come in and they've said, well, we've decided that we're going to adopt this doctrine of judicial review, which came early in the sort of setup of test driving our Constitution. The Supreme Court essentially interpreted their role as a body that's capable of checking and making sure that these laws that Congress is passing are indeed constitutional. And so one of the ways that they can check this expanded scope of legislative influence from Congress is they could say, this rule, maybe Congress has somehow passed a law saying that, like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like a wildly unconstitutional law, maybe a law saying that, like, the president shall have the right to remove all state constitutions from existence or something, strike them out. That's obviously not part of the way that our system is set up, and so that might be that law might be considered unconstitutional. And so judicial review is another way in which this elastic clause can be sort of kept in check. And so again, like, I want to make a clear difference or differentiation in this discussion of checks and balances versus this idea of federalism, which is the main topic of study for this week. So we talked last time in Module 2 about some of the overlapping, shared, and differentiated powers that Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court have in in their various articles described in the Constitution. So Articles 1, 2, and 3 describe these three branches and how they might work. And critically, again, we saw that the sort of Madisonian design of the Constitution was one in which we'd have no one branch really having exclusive control over the others. Rather, Congress can check the presidency can check Congress, Supreme Court can check both of the others. And so we don't have one single group able to sort of take power exclusively. However, all of those checks and balances are happening at the federal level, by which I mean they're happening at the level of the national government. Federalism, which again, I'm using federal in a couple of different ways, so it's important to keep track of this terminology. By federalism, I'm talking about the relationship between that whole federal or national government, right, Congress, Supreme Court, presidency, and the governments of states. And so by the government of states, again, I want to be very clear, I'm talking about what the state constitution of a specific state sets up as being that specific government. So in our case, we would be talking about the governor of Maryland and the state legislature. So that's the key difference here that we want to be talking about.